Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to those of you who were here this morning, and to those of you like me who could not be here this morning. Glad that you could make it now. I'm Doris Bergen, the Chancellor Rosen-Ray Wolf Professor of Holocaust Studies here at the University of Toronto, and it's my pleasure to chair this panel and also to be one of the discussants. I think we have a very straightforward arrangement. You have all the biographical information, so I'm not going to say anything about our speakers other than to tell you that our session is called The Evolution of the Concept of Genocide, Holocaust-Shoah, that we have three speakers. Our first speaker, Annette Tim. Our second speaker, Danny Blattman, cannot be here, but his paper will be read by Frank Sisson. Our third speaker, Rotem Galadi, and after the three of them, we'll have a coffee break and resume for discussion. So, Professor Tim.
I am going to stand. I don't usually need the mic, but I like to stand. So I'm just going to give some path through my definitely too long paper and give you some highlights and the major points that I was trying to bring across. I begin the paper with a somewhat vaguely told story about a survivor who I met and who told me over lunch, as opposed to in her presentation to a group of high school students, that she had been hidden in a church in Poland and molested as a child by her supposed protectors. And this story, I couldn't shake this story after she told it to me, not because it was particularly surprising. It's not surprising that children in such vulnerable situations are occasionally abused, but that it clearly haunted her that she hadn't been able to find a venue to tell her story, that it bothered her that she was asked by the organizers of this Holocaust symposium meant to educate high school students about the Holocaust not to say anything about that, and that for years she had been delivering her Holocaust experience without being able to tell that part of her experience. I don't want my paper to be read as saying that we have no historical investigations of sexual violence in the Holocaust, or that all victims have been silenced in this way, but I think that it should be taken as read that this aspect of survivor experience has been massively underplayed. I also want to assert that historians' failures, and not just historians, but that's the audience that I'm thinking of right now, to integrate this aspect of genocide into their accounts has consequences in our present. Although press reports about sexual violence committed against refugees and victims of ethnic cleansing and genocide reach us far more frequently now than they used to, so I'm thinking here of the Rohingya crisis, other aspects, and despite the recognition that this issue recently received with the bestowing of the Nobel Peace Prize on Denis Mukwege, I thought I had it pronounced, but the African doctor, and Nadia Murad from Syria, for their efforts to raise awareness about sexual violence as a weapon of war, it's still too easy, I would argue, to forget. We still have a hard time remembering that any systematic dehumanization of an entire population will create possibilities for sexual abuse, particularly of the most vulnerable, women, but also children. How much is this about genocide, and how much is it about the vulnerability of masses of people in any situation of what Scott Strauss calls categorical violence? I've been rethinking my paper already in the context of having read yours, and I would rewrite it differently now. I think we could, in some sense, by saying I have 5 reasons why sexual violence should be part of the definition of genocide. I took that category somewhat for granted, but I think you could see in my paper that I also struggled with it and suggested that maybe the fact that sexual violence was purged or very quickly forgotten in the early definitions of genocide maybe says something about the problematic nature of that category as a whole. So I find myself rather less convinced than I have been that the concept genocide really helps us very much, and I think maybe I really took Strauss's call for a discussion of categorical violence seriously, and I'd like to think a lot more about that. Having said that, I would argue that the term still matters because the laws matter, Labels matter, laws matter, as Carolyn Fernet told us. It matters that since Rwanda and Yugoslavia, rape has been explicitly integrated into the definition of genocide, both in terms of punishment of the perpetrators and for the well-being and memories of the survivors. So this fact, I would say, just simply makes it more difficult for historians of the Holocaust to blithely claim that Rassenschande laws, race defilement laws, somehow prevented rape. This is simply not plausible, given the information that we now have. It was, I would argue, almost an excuse not to look for that evidence in the Holocaust, and because there was no legal imperative to do so, because rape wasn't explicitly in the category of genocide at the time. So I wrote the essay with the concept of genocide in mind, but I think it's important to still trouble that category on the basis of this discussion of sexual violence. The term hid a certain kind of violence, and it precluded certain kinds of comparisons that I would now think are more important. I could say more about that. But so now, just to help you a little bit through the structure of my paper, I have really sort of two organizational strategies. The first is the 5 reasons that I provide throughout the paper why sexual violence has to be part of this definition of genocide, including the genocide perpetrated by Nazi Germany. I'm going to list off those 5 categories again just to remind you. I'm sure that now I and all of you can come up with other reasons as well, but those are just the 5 that I managed in this paper. And then there's a second organizational layer that is historiographical, the historiographical, social, and cultural context for historicizing the silence. How is it that this widespread experience wasn't integrated into popular memory and other aspects and historical research on the Holocaust? The key answer here is a discomfort with testimony in general. In the first years after the war, the first historiographical passes, and a very specific wedding of historiographical technique to modes that privileged political and military history over cultural and social aspects. So it was literally not in the toolbox of historians at the time to discuss these things. It's important, in other words, to understand, I would argue, the historiographical, methodological, epistemological reasons for ignoring testimony to understand why sexual violence in particular was ignored. Sexual violence almost always involves very individual, very personal testimony, as I think we know just from watching the news these days. I would argue also that the historians of this first wave of Holocaust research didn't have the tools to describe or integrate into their accounts emotional experiences. Robert Cribb talks about this in his paper. We still need the tools for doing that. We're beginning to do that. In other words, these early views of the Holocaust that helped establish the definition of genocide were incomplete. We can build on this work, but I think now our choices of evidence and our ways of arguing them are different, have changed. And then I spend some time also discussing the cultural social reasons for why these accounts did not come out, and that has to do with the situation of the survivors themselves, their situation of being displaced and looking for new lives in other countries. That story of sexual violence could not have helped them in their circumstances. It didn't pave the way for emigration. It was not validated at the time by legal and welfare authorities. There was no one to tell the story to, except perhaps those very first raw emotional testimonies, as I said, most of which are in Yiddish, which would have included these things. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, survivors were reticent to tell their stories of sexual violence because they were quite reasonably worried that doing so would lead to the charge from within their own community that they had risked permanent moral degradation in order to survive. In other words, that it would have come back to them that this sexual violence or instrumentalized sexual relationships that they had undergone would have been used against them as an illegitimate means of survival. So after that, I provide a somewhat too detailed and yet pretty impressionistic and incomplete overview of historiographical developments that should by now have given us better tools to understand these things, a move to more openness towards cultural explanations, more willingness to accept the role of memory culture in the history of the Holocaust, more attention to the testimony of survivors, tools in the history of sexuality, oral history, gender, and emotions. We need all of these tools to be able to do this work, and those tools were not available to the first wave of historical Holocaust researchers. This leads me to the point that I didn't necessarily make in the essay, but I think which is implied. In some sense, the rejection of emotion as a subject for historical inquiry is at the heart of some of these problems of not being able to cope with this. It is, I didn't say this, but it is not irrelevant that the most of the researchers, historians doing this work in the early years were men. I don't say that because men cannot somehow cope with emotions or trauma or understand it. Instead, it's a longer-term understanding of the gendered dynamics of these things. As historians of gender understand, these men were themselves subject to the tradition of Western political discourse that associated public reason with a masculine ability to control and domesticate emotions. So they were also subject to this problem of not having the tools or the political acceptance of being able to speak about these incredibly intense emotions at the time. So sexual violence simply found no place in explanatory models of the Holocaust that emphasized calculated ideological motivations and technocratic or medicalized racial planning. Lots more to say on that. The gist is, I think that we can do better now. We have better tools. We have more diverse and culturally aware methodologies. We also have a much clearer picture of how sexual violence fits into all genocidal logics. In other words, we have examples about which we know much more, that receive much more media attention of this sexual violence. Okay, so then I cite 5 reasons. In general, first of all, I begin with the story of this survivor I met, because it is a survivor's story, because it was experienced, even if the people who experienced this kind of violence, for various completely understandable reasons, could not speak about it afterwards. A key reason why they could not speak of it afterwards is to talk about one's own sexual suffering to family members who survived was also difficult and problematic. It would have also pained survivors who had lived in more protective circumstances. It's understandable, in other words, that the individuals themselves would have placed this in a different category and not wanted to want to speak about it. I think, though, that makes it imperative that we read silences in the documents, out of the documents. The example that I gave in the paper was of the British transcribers of conversations of stories between POWs, where the transcriber just doesn't write down all the words, but just writes women, women, women. In other words, that the casual way in which these German soldiers were talking about these kinds of less than consensual relationships with women was so ubiquitous that it didn't even seem important to either to them or to the transcribers in POW camps in Britain. So we have to read the silences, we have to look in places we might not need to. And then we have to do more, I would say, than simply plunk these episodes of sexual violence into larger stories. I take Cesarani to task for this in his big compendium of Holocaust history. I'm not sure whether I'm being totally fair to him, but there's ways in which it can't just be the extra little bit of violence tucked into the larger account. We need a larger thematic. 2 minutes? 5? Okay, good. 5 I've got. Number 2, sexual violence is now part of the legal definition of genocide. It just is there. I would say that this matters looking backwards. I won't go into any more detail about that, but I think that even if we think about how the general public now defines genocide, we as Holocaust historians will be asked, what about rape and sexual violence? It's in the definition. We need to have answers for those stories. I will skip a little bit here. There's lasting consequences to this kind of violence that is comparable to other kinds of categorical violence. in other places, whether or not we apply the definition of genocide. So I would argue, just to give a Canadian example, that Canadian residential schools, whether we discuss them as genocide, there was sexual violence perpetrated on Native children in these residential schools that has lasting consequences that one could argue has an actual effect on the body of those cultures, not just the culture, but the ability to reproduce in cultures, and that we have to look at those comparisons in a way that is perhaps broader than the definition of genocide. 3, if we ignore sexual violence, pornographers will happily fill the gap in the public discussion. I'm not sure, I have to think about it, whether the Nazi exploitation that I discussed in the 70s was a specific moment. This was really a gap in the discussion at that point. Historians were not talking about sexual violence. And when there is that gap, I would argue that popularizers, sensationalizers fill that gap. I think there's 2 sides to that. In one sense, they were discussing something that had happened and that had no other venue to be discussed. On the other hand, they did so in a way that was ultimately pornographic and shut down discussion of these things. So I think it's a very ambivalent situation, and I'm not sure that I could make the case that the same would be true today. I think that's a specific moment in the 70s, but was important. And it also affected, I would argue, the historians writing at the time. So Andrea, I'm going to quote you. You told me that as a 16-year-old, you had joked about Ilse, She-Wolf of the SS, that there was a large understanding amongst teenagers at the time. The same, Israelis have told me the same thing about Katzetnik novels, how they were very aware of these things and how it was part of their cultural upbringing. Those people become historians. That pornographization, which I cannot say that word, has an effect on how they view these things. 4, paying attention to sexual violence highlights the blurred boundaries and gray zones. And this is a very uncomfortable aspect when we go deeper into the documents and specific personal experiences. Molly Applebaum's diary, which I know you discussed just recently with Jan Grabowski here at the University of Toronto, describes a story that is very difficult and that involves some sexual pleasure on the part of the survivors who were having sex with their protector. It is not a simple, straightforward, openly violent rape in the way that we think about it. There are all kinds of gray zones. There's instrumentalized sex. There is sex for survival. There's sexual barter. It doesn't always happen between perpetrator and victim. It occasionally happens between victims. It is a very, very gray and difficult zone, and it is part of the dynamics of how these things function. So we need to know about these things. And finally, just the parallels that are worth emphasizing. I think that the failure of Holocaust historians to talk about these things made the public discussion of the vulnerability of large groups of people in any situation of violent displacement more difficult, and we are less likely to try to build in safeguards. So I think of the children involved in displacement, how whether or not this is genocidal, however you talk about it, we haven't developed yet a discussion about how those things immediately need to be assumed, that these things will happen, and we need to protect the vulnerable against this kind of abuse. Thank you.
So I'm not Professor Blackman. Most of you have had, many of you have had the opportunity to read this paper. It's a relatively lengthy paper, and I'm not going to be able to read even most of it. The paper is on diverse narratives or separate histories, the Polish-Israeli debate over the so-called Holocaust law. To give you the summary of the paper, it first discusses why this has become a contemporary political event involving international relations between Poland and Israel, and then internally in both of those countries. It then goes on to discuss how Israeli Holocaust law came about and why it came about. It then goes on to discuss the Holocaust law in Poland that aroused such controversy, internally in Poland and between Israeli and Polish scholars, and then to discuss how it was amended and in which Ukrainians become an important subject and object of this law, and therefore are drawn into a discussion, changing some of the Polish discussion of Jews during the Holocaust. And then ends all a discussion of how historians at Yad Vashem have criticized what the Israeli government has done as a distortion of history, and how there have been such voices in Poland as well. The paper begins. The Holocaust in Poland was recently the topic of a heated debate between Israel and Poland. It began when the Polish government decided to add 2 subsections to what is referred to as the Polish Holocaust Law. These clauses amended the Instytut Pamięci Narodowej law, which established the Polish Institute of National Memory in 1998 to investigate the crimes committed by the Nazi and Soviet totalitarian regimes against the Polish people. The amendment prohibits any public criticism of Poland or the Polish people for their liability in the crimes against the Jews on Polish soil during the German occupation. In June 2018, Israel and Poland reached an agreement that the amended law would be revised. In a joint statement, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki announced that the criminal sanctions mandated by the Polish law would be repealed. At the same time, Israel accepted the Polish historical narrative that Poland should not be held accountable for the murder of Jews during the Holocaust. This mutual understanding was harshly criticized both in Israel and in Poland. Historians and public figures in Israel accused their government of undermining the memory of the Holocaust and sacrificing it in favor of economic and political interests. Morawiecki's government was reproached by ultranationalist and anti-Semitic members of the Polish Sejm for its submission to Jewish interests. These polar reactions to the joint Israeli-Polish statement reflect the significant gap between the two societies' historical discourses about how the Holocaust should be remembered. The demand for acknowledgement that Poles bore no responsibility for the extermination of Jews during the Holocaust is a matter of utmost significance for the Polish national memory, because the Poles consider themselves to be the victims of the German occupation alongside the Jews. It is indeed the case that 3 million ethnic Poles were killed by the Nazis during the war. The Poles also claim to be victims of a second brutal occupation after the war by the communist regime imposed by the Soviets. Nevertheless, the notion that Polish anti-Semitism was second only to the Nazis is widely accepted in Israel. The numerous testimonies about public denunciation and attacks on Jews during the Holocaust, the betrayal of Jews to Germans, massacres such as Jedwabne, and the murderous violence against Holocaust survivors who returned to Poland after the war, like the pogrom in Kielce, have shaped the Israeli public view that the Poles share responsibility for the Holocaust with the Nazis. Then the legislature and the historical memory, Israel. One of the main assertions voiced in Israel against the understandings between Israel and Poland was that the Israeli prime minister was acquitting the Poles and allowing them to renounce their guilt and responsibility for the murder of Jews during the Holocaust. This distorts the historical truth and indirectly provides ammunition to Holocaust deniers. Therefore, I want to claim that it is important to understand what stands behind the Holocaust-related legislation in Israel and in Poland, especially on the topic of Holocaust denial. It then goes on to discuss Israel as the first country in the world to pass a law that explicitly forbids oral or written denial of the Holocaust. At first glance, this is no surprise. There were similar laws, for example, in the German Federal Republic and Austria that banned Nazi propaganda or commemoration of events from the history of the Third Reich. But it was only in the late 1980s, and especially in the early 1990s, that legislation explicitly outlining Holocaust denial was enacted in various countries.
In Israel, which would seem to be the last country where there is a possibility or risk of publications or statements that deny the Holocaust, such a law was passed on July the 8th, 1986. The paper then goes on to discuss the terms of this law and the reasons it was enacted by the Israeli parliament. The core of the discussion is that it was a unifying event that unified Jews from various backgrounds in defense of Jews internationally. And the fact that both left and right in Israel could combine in supporting this law, and that it could include Jews, for example, such as Jews from Saloniki, who take part in this, as well as the more traditional Ashkenazi communities, are important for understanding why this law was important for an assertion of Jewish identity. He quotes in length a number of the speeches in the Knesset of that time as to when the law was enacted and who took part in that enactment. And so, above all, associates it with the Waldheim affair. That is, the importance of the reaction or need to respond to Waldheim is seen as part of the initiative for such a law being passed as a response of Jews of Israel to the way the Holocaust would be perceived. Ultimately, the matter of intent was inserted into the third section of the law as passed. With the perspective of more than 3 decades since the outlining of Holocaust denial in Israel, we can say that it attempts to preserve the balance that some say is not really possible between Israel's definition as Jewish and as democratic, the need to maintain the Holocaust as an element of pan-Jewish identity on the one hand, and the desire not to limit freedom of speech and expression on the other. As mentioned, the law has never been tested before in Israeli court and has received almost no attention in any way in any of the many fierce debates in Israel about the Holocaust, its memory, and its commemoration. We could say that the law has almost been forgotten, and this indicates mainly that it was not intended to deal with a real problem facing Israeli society. I assume that this was probably known to more of you, so I went shorter on this. Now to turn to the legislature and the historical memory, Poland. Poland never enacted a law similar to the Israeli legislation. Holocaust denial is banned as part of the December 1998 law that established the Instytut Pamięci Narodowej, the national authority to research and commemorate the crimes against the Polish people by the Nazi and communist regimes. Article 55 contains what can be read as outlawing Holocaust denial. Article 55 of the Polish law says, "He who publicly and contrary to facts contradicts the crimes mentioned in Article 1, Clause 1, shall be subject to a fine or penalty of deprivation of liberty up to 3 years. The judgment shall be made publicly known." Article 1, "This act shall govern 1. The registration, collection, access, management, and use of the documents of the organs of state security created and collected between the 22nd of July, 1944 and the 31st of December, 1989, and the documents of the organs of security of the Third Reich and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics concerning crimes perpetrated against people of Polish nationality and Polish citizens of other ethnicity, nationalities in the period between 1 September 1939 and 31 December 1989. Nazi crimes, communist crimes, other crimes constituting crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. The difference between the Polish and Israeli laws is obvious. First of all, the Israeli law has a universal meaning in the sense that it does not distinguish among incidents that took place during the Holocaust in the various places it occurred. The Polish law, by contrast, refers to crimes that occurred on Polish soil. The Israeli statute refers to the Holocaust and the Nazi crimes against the Jews and crimes against humanity, whereas the Polish law makes no explicit mention of a separate Jewish fate. The reference to crimes against citizens during the period of German occupation specifies that they were against people of Polish nationality and Polish citizens of other ethnicity and nationalities. This formulation is important. And then he goes on to discuss who would be meant by Polish citizens of other nationalities, saying some might be Roma and some might be Ukrainian, but of course the overwhelming majority of such groups were Jews. So they are in that sense included as Polish citizens. Then he goes on to discuss the other differentiations of the two laws. The first is connected to the time frame of the crimes perpetrated against the Polish people. Whereas the Israeli law has no need to define the period to which the term Holocaust refers, the Polish statute defines the time between 1 September 1939, the German invasion, and 31 December 1989, when single-party communist rule formally ended in Poland, as a single period. Poles take a monolithic view of the crimes of the two totalitarian regimes. This is a crucial element, for it is that is quite irrelevant to the history of the Holocaust as understood in Israel. The second is that from the perspective of the Polish state, there is no difference between victims defined as Polish citizens and those defined as Polish citizens of other ethnic origin. In other words, a Pole murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis, a Jew from Warsaw murdered in Treblinka, and a Pole murdered in the Gulag of the Stalinist regime in 1940 or in 1952 for his opposition are all seen as alike. Whereas in Israel, the study of the Holocaust has always made extensive use of German documents to corroborate points such as Nazi anti-Semitism and the various stages of the anti-Jewish policy. In Poland, given the desire to combine the crimes of the German occupier and those of the communist regime in a single statute, the legislature had to refer to the extensive documentation found in state archives since the fall of the regime in 1989, although these documents do not necessarily deal with crimes against the Polish people. But because the law is a priori defines the communist regime as criminal that committed crimes against the Polish people, the documentation is left and cannot serve as evidence that is not fundamentally criminal. Okay, the next part of his paper, and I have limited time to discuss it, is why after the controversy about the law was amended in various ways. The emendations of the law of Article 1, which I read earlier, now reads to say, Nazi crimes, communist crimes, crimes committed by Ukrainian nationalists and members of Ukrainian units collaborating with the Third Reich, and other felonies that constitute crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, or war crimes committed against persons of Polish nationality or Polish citizens of other nationalities between 8 November 1917, notice change in date, and 31 July 1990. Then goes on to discuss acts committed by Ukrainian nationalists and others between 1925 and 1950. 50 is under this law, and then points out that the Jewish factor is specifically mentioned in relation to the eastern areas of Poland and the areas where various Ukrainian groups might have or could have committed crimes against Polish citizens of various nationalities. And with such, the Jewish factor is placed into this discussion. So that the Ukrainian issue then becomes central into how that law is now interpreted over this period. And then he goes on to say that there are a number of reasons to criticize this law and problems in dealing with the law. For example, the Third Reich is mentioned even though the date 1925 is placed into the law, of course, when the Third Reich did not exist. So therefore, there's a problem in the timing of how this law works at the present time, and that is done obviously specifically because of Polish-Ukrainian issues having nothing to do with the Holocaust. He then goes on to discuss crimes that might have been committed by Poles against Ukrainians, and above all, the action, the Akcja Wisła, or the ethnic cleansing of the eastern territories of what is the Polish state that emerges after World War II. He then says, the national memory law's tendentious presentation of the extremely complex problems related to the relations among Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians in eastern Poland in the 20th century did not attract attention or even passing mention in the controversy triggered by the amendments to the Article 55. Poland was attacked by Israeli politicians and Holocaust historians, primarily those affiliated with Yad Vashem. Poland was accused of attempting to conceal the Poles' participation in the murder of Jews during the war, well known today thanks to the series of studies published over the last 20 years. He then discusses the political actions within Israel, above all, the discussion of the relation between Netanyahu and Morawiecki, and the criticism that has been placed by Yad Vashem historians that these interpretations of Polish Jewish past do not fit either the work that has been done by Yad Vashem or Israeli legislation. And then, okay, and I won't need the 2 minutes on it then. And then, in practice, sees this political deal that has been made by the Polish and Israeli governments as having gone contrary to historical research, and ends by saying, the conclusion is that we are not dealing with legislation that can be classified as either factually or historically accurate or is meant to support an authorized historiography, in discussing the very different ways that this law has evolved. Later in the discussion, since the one factor I do know something about is the Ukrainian issue, and that there has been a discussion of that, I'll then become a discussant.
Thank you. The first generation of historical writing on the idea of genocide. All right.
Yes, sir.
How's that? All right. The first generation of historical writings on the idea of genocide and the Genocide Convention tended to consider Raphael Lemkin's advocacy as a Jewish project. Later, historians began questioning the contradictory evidence left by Lemkin, who at times portrayed genocide in global and universal terms, while at others invoked its 20th century modern and Jewish particularity. To trace the intellectual, political, and ideological origins of Lemkin's project, some have accordingly proposed to read genocide against a broader register of Jewish experience and a broader spectrum of Jewish politics. In this vein, James Leffler recently presented compelling evidence of Lemkin's early interwar Zionism. Leffler went on to argue that Lemkin's Zionism shaped the development of his idea of genocide. Zionism, Leffler wrote, provided Lemkin with the imaginative vocabulary with which to reconceptualize the relationship between nationhood, culture, and law in the face of modern anti-Semitism and violence. Today I will take issue with this reading. I do not contest that before the war, Lemkin subscribed to Zionism, even if I cannot see any evidence that Zionism had any impact on his thinking on genocide, even back in the 1930s. I propose rather that while Jewish nationalism did play a cardinal role in Lemkin's concept of genocide, it was not Zionism, but a different, competing model of Jewish nationalism. Lemkin, like many other Jewish interwar international law scholars and activists, had subscribed to several creeds. Like others who lived through the Holocaust years, he came to choose among them. It is less important in this respect that Lemkin deliberately excised the Zionist chapter from his memoir. What is important is that his thinking on genocide was predicated on a model of Jewish nationalism that became already in the mid-1930s antithetical to Zionism. So basically genocide as an instance of Jewish politics. What I propose, therefore, is to consider the Genocide Convention, its making and its reception, as an arena where different ideologies, different models of Jewish nationalism and of Jewish emancipation competed. This forms part of a broader project that considers international law in general since the late 19th century as a field of intra-Jewish political ideological contestation. This is the crux of my forthcoming book titled Jews, Sovereignty and International Law in Early Israeli Diplomacy. What I present here today is based loosely on two chapters that account for the Jewish politics surrounding the Genocide Convention. To demonstrate my claim about competing models of Jewish nationalism, I will first present evidence on ambivalence. Evidence that Lemkin was ambivalent towards the Jewish state, and evidence that the agents of the Jewish state, and before them agents of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, were ambivalent about Lemkin and his project. I will focus in particular on instances of mutual aversion. This will allow me, second, to demonstrate the existence of two diametrically opposed ideological and national readings of the Genocide Convention. All right. For more than 2 years, two parallel Jewish campaigns took place at the United Nations. One concerned the drafting and promotion of the Genocide Convention, the other the partition of Palestine, the establishment of a Jewish state, its admission to the UN. The two campaigns took place at the same UN organs who were meeting at times in the same cities. Often, both campaigns involved the same UN functionaries and diplomats. Remarkably, between December 1946 and Israel's admission to the UN in May of 1949, there had been no contact between these two Jewish campaigns. That is not to say that Lemkin did not portray the Genocide Convention as a Jewish project. At times, he did. At times, he even portrayed it as a Zionist project to the right audience. In 1950, on one such rare occasion, he told an American Zionist organization that, next to arms to Israel, this convention ranges as very important for the legal and diplomatic defense of Israel in the United Nations and in the diplomatic world at large. This appears to attest to Lemkin's persisting Zionism. Yet Lemkin often packaged and sold the idea of genocide in contradictory terms to opposing sides, as we have heard, to Russians and Ukrainians, to Russian diplomats and American lawmakers, to Arabs and to Jews. His campaign drew heavily at times on the support of Arab and Muslim diplomats, at others on Jewish NGOs. Just as he presented the Genocide Convention as a Jewish or Zionist cause, so he could present it as an Arab or Muslim cause. In the late 1950s, Lemkin authored a memorandum titled The Genocide Convention and the Muslim World, where he pronounced, the Genocide Convention owes much to the statesmen of the Muslim world. One of these was, we heard already, Mohammad Zafrullah Khan, who during the Palestine partition debate earned the grudging respect of Jewish agency envoys. They described him as the most articulate opponent of the partition plan, and one of the most impressive delegates present from any country. Lemkin also was in debt to Saudi Arabia. In 1946, the Saudis submitted the first draft of the Genocide Convention to the UN. That, however, did not stop Lemkin from approaching Israel's UN mission in late 1953 with a proposal to put the convention into operation in respect of anti-Israeli statements made by the recently enthroned King Saud. Lemkin's advocacy was faithful neither to the Zionist cause nor to his former allies. He could shower equally exaggerated praise on Arab, Muslim, European, or Jewish diplomats. That was part and parcel of his modus operandi. In late 1949, he cabled David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, thanking him for the splendid cooperation of the Israeli delegation at the UN in the matter of the Genocide Convention. The cable, as we shall see, was entirely disingenuous. Before Israel's admission to the UN in May 1949, its delegates, and before them the Jewish agency's delegates to the UN, were at best only dimly aware of the Genocide Convention. Before and for some time after Israel's admission, Lemkin kept his distance from the Jewish state. In part, that was tactical. He was hoping to keep his project away from the entanglements of the Palestine debate. For some time, he would try to influence Israel's foreign policy through intermediaries. He wrote an appeal to Israel's chief rabbi. He asked some Jewish NGOs and likely UN functionaries to promote the idea of Israeli ratification of the convention. When he required the support of the Jewish state, he would cable Ben-Gurion or Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet, going over the heads of reluctant mid-level diplomats. After such methods failed, he began making direct overtures to Israel's diplomatic apparatus. These overtures, however, attest more to the difficulties of his campaign than to any Zionist sensibility. Lemkin's interest in the Jewish state was instrumental. He had tried to enlist its diplomatic resources to the cause of his campaign. Lemkin's attempts were not successful. The files of the foreign ministry, the Israeli foreign ministry, are replete with examples of the Jewish state rebuffing his overtures with regard to King Saud's speech, with regard to the Chinese revision of the Genocide Convention, or with regard to other proposals and demands that he had presented upon the Jewish state. At first, Israel's diplomats were disinterested in the Genocide Convention. The UN priorities focused on the Palestine debate. But this interest survived Israel's establishment. Jacob Robinson, the legal advisor of Israel's UN mission, considered the convention, although a Jewish concern, a marginal problem of no direct concern to the Jewish state. Robinson, however, had no qualms with using the convention instrumentally to promote ancillary Israeli interest in the UN debate. In September 1948, for example, he advised that the forthcoming General Assembly discussion on genocide may offer an excellent occasion, he wrote, to take up the treatment of Jews in Oriental countries. He meant Eastern Bloc countries. Equally, he wrote, a case may be made against the practice in Arab states vis-à-vis the Jewish communities. Robinson was not concerned with the prospect that this might derail Lemkin's project. In time, when opportunities presented themselves, Israel would develop a limited and instrumental interest in the Genocide Convention. Within days of its UN admission, May 1949, the Secretary General, the President of the General Assembly, and the chief UN lawyer all approached the representatives of the new member, requesting it to sign and ratify the convention. Israel's diplomat recognized this as a low-cost opportunity to display good UN membership and earn the goodwill of important interlocutors and allies. Israel signed and ratified the convention for gaining its diplomatic standing, to some extent, not because of, but despite its Jewish aspect. Another opportunity arose in 1951, when member states of the UN were invited to plead before the International Court of Justice on the highly technical question of the validity of reservations to the Genocide Convention. At first, Israel's foreign ministry lawyers were uninterested. Shabtai Rosen, the legal advisor, soon realized, however, that this was the perfect opportunity for him to go to The Hague and appear before the World Court. He wrote to Robinson, his colleague in New York, that it would be useful to obtain some practical experience in the court, especially since the case involved no Cold War politics. He added, the proceedings in the court can be regarded as a kind of a student's moot. In time, Rosen would become the leading international authority on the court. This and other episodes also furnish evidence on aversion towards Lemkin and his project. While drafting his court statement, Rosen described Lemkin as one who claims to have coined the phrase genocide. Robinson, 20 years older than Rosen, corrected him. Rosen, rather than credit Lemkin, omitted any reference to him in the final version of his court statement. In court, he linked the convention to the Jewish tragedy, but did not give credit for its making or promotion to any Jewish individual or organization. Robinson, in fact, advised him not to discuss the Jewish aspect of the convention at all. Rosen responded that this reference was meant to serve, and I quote, more public relations than actual content. So why would the Jewish state, and in particular its lawyers, be averse to Lemkin and his scheme for protection of Jewish rights? One answer points to grudges that drew on past acquaintances, especially in the case of Robinson, but were fueled by sovereign sensibilities of Robinson and Rosen as the official representatives of what they considered the only official Jewish voice in the world arena, the Jewish state. Lemkin's totally unofficial campaign undermined their own official sovereign status. When Lemkin proposed that Israel mark the convention's entry into force and promote its ratification, Robinson informed Rosen that he was reluctant to celebrate the entry into force of the Genocide Convention. He added, I cannot see why we should become the lobbyist for the convention. We have sufficient troubles of our own. Rosen's court statement was rife with subtle allusions to the fact that he, alone in the courtroom, had the legal standing to speak with a Jewish voice. These sovereign sensibilities, however, went beyond standing and voice. Ambivalence drew on a fundamental disagreement on Jewish emancipation. For Robinson, Rosen, and others, there was fault with how the convention constructed Jews and what protection it prescribed for their survival in a modern world. When Minister of Justice Felix Rosenbluth presented the convention to Israel's parliament, the Knesset, he spoke of its Jewish significance and its lofty, exalted goals. He added, however, the convention presents no solution for our dispersed people in the diaspora. The radical solution is known to us. The radical solution is known to us. The Genocide Convention constructed Jews as a minority group. In this respect, Lemkin's work drew, as we heard, on 2 decades of Jewish experience in Central and Eastern Europe with minority rights. These interwar experiments and Lemkin's own concept of genocide sought to protect the separate existence and the cultural specificity of Jewish national minorities. From a Jewish perspective, Lemkin's work gave effect to Jewish diaspora nationalism. That political ideology, developed by Simon Dubnov and Chaim Jitlovsky, prescribed that Jewish national life could be exercised fully, without territory, in the diaspora. It called for legally recognized minority protection in national as well as international law. Like Zionism, the vision of diaspora nationalism sought international law's guarantee for collective Jewish rights and made recourse to international organizations, such as the League of Nations, for their enforcement. Diaspora nationalism evolved as a critique of Zionism. It rejected the Zionist investment in territory and in the future. It offered, instead, a vision of investment in national life in the diaspora, in the present, an immediate program of action for addressing the immediate plight of Jews in Central and Eastern Europe. This vision proved so appealing that practically all Jewish political parties, including Zionist parties, came to espouse its program of work of the present. Programmatically, Zionism accepted that it had to practice national work in the diaspora. Ideologically, it remained opposed to the diaspora, negating it. Yet Zionism all along rejected the construction of Jews as a minority. Being a minority everywhere was part of the problem, not the solution. The need for international legal protection only accentuated the deficient, inferior legal status of the Jewish people. Sovereign statehood was an attribute of majorities, not minorities. Zionism's aversion to minority politics, minority status, and minority rights intensified in the 1930s. In Europe, when the promise of the minority system proved false, and in Palestine, where Zionist leaders rejected any proposal that would entrench the minority status of Jews. In 1937, Ben-Gurion told one royal commission, looking into the situation in Palestine, that in the diaspora, Jews were subject to the benevolence of the majority, always subject to the benevolence or whip of others. In 1947, he insisted in a UN speech that the Jews in their own historic homeland can under no condition be made to remain a subordinate, dependent minority as they are in the diaspora. Sharet, soon to be the foreign minister, on his part, warned the UN against condemning the Yishuv, the political community, Jewish political community in Palestine, to the faithful bane of Jewish homelessness, constituting a minority in every country in the world. The Jewish people in Palestine, he told the Security Council, will never accept the status of a minority depending on the charity of others, a frozen, shrinking minority, taking solace in paper guarantees. Years later, Sharet would reminisce how, at age 9 no less, he had read the first edition of Dubnov's multi-volume Jewish history. I was raised on both Dubnov the historian and on war on Dubnovism as a false and perverse doctrine. Ideologically, diaspora nationalism was antithetical to the most fundamental creed of political Zionism. Back to our protagonists. Like Justice Minister Rosen, the foreign ministry lawyers prefer the radical solution of sovereign statehood over the tested and failed protection of Jewish group rights in the diaspora. In internal correspondence, Shabtai Rosen often dismissed the convention and its value. More to the point, he rejected its Jewish value. There is no doubt, he wrote in early 1951, that the Genocide Convention does not safeguard the Jewish people against the Holocaust. Robinson, a converted veteran of Jewish minority politics who came to abandon during the war years his commitment to diaspora nationalism, agreed. The Genocide Convention, he informed Rosen, should not be considered as a matter which gives any particular guarantee to the Jewish people against possible future acts of mass terror. Ideologically speaking, the Genocide Convention could not only embody the creed of a competing political theory, it also undermines Zionism's greatest and recent achievement, majority status and political sovereignty.
Thank you so much to our speakers for being so prompt. And we can now reconvene after the coffee break for the discussion.